Christmas 2024 brings up the next round of Thomascember, this time looking at Series 4 episode by episode, one of the most popular series in the franchise. And wouldn't you know it, this year also marks the 40th anniversary of the TV series. That's quite a milestone for the franchise. And what better way to celebrate 40 years of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends by going through the 4th series episode by episode. I just can't think of a better way to celebrate this great milestone by going through each episode of what many consider to be one of the best series in the show. The series that introduces the narrow gauge engines and Stepney the Bluebell engine. I find that quite a celebrating way to celebrate 40 years of this classic TV series. And as the last few years, it's going to be episode by episode for Series 4, everything you need to know about each character that was introduced in the series, trivial behind the scenes facts about the episodes, as well as differences between these episodes and the stories from the Railway series that they were based on. It's full steam ahead for Thomascember 2024. Filming of the 4th series took place between June 1994 and November 1994. The 4th series saw the introduction of the smaller narrow gauge engines. Members of the film crew have noted that they did not like filming with the O gauge scale models. The cylinders would jam, the eye mechanisms were faulty as they required an external battery pack to function, which had to be hidden either in enclosed coaches, trucks or vans, and the body shells of the locomotives were too small for smoke units alongside their motors. For the narrow gauge episodes, the production team used a 1992 publication called Little Trains of Britain for reference. This included locations, buildings, fuel tanks, coaches, liveries, and even Smudge's face. And it's a well-known fact that Wilbert Awdry hated Series 3 since it had a lot more stories that weren't based on any of his or Chris's stories. So for this series, Britt Allcroft and David Mitton went back to the drawing board and decided to go back to the Railway series. And the most logical thing at that time was introduce the narrow gauge engines. Of course, back for the first 3 seasons of the show, they didn't have the technology or the skills to bring the narrow gauge engines to life since they were a lot smaller than the standard gauge engines. But since they'd really got their foot in with the series and tested the limits of what they could do with their model making, they put those skills to the test to create the narrow gauge engines, which meant that we had a lot more stories in this series that were based on the Railway series books. With the exception of the episode Rusty to the Rescue, which was completely written by Britt and David. But we'll get to that when we get to that. The series also introduced Stepney, a character based on the real-life engine and used to highlight the preservation movement in the books. He was given an entirely different background when he was introduced. The late Michael Angelis returned to narrate the series for the UK, and the late George Carlin returned to narrate the US versions. Veteran composers Michael Donnell and Junior Campbell stuck around to compose the series' music. The series was first released on VHS in November 1994, then aired on television in March 1996 in the UK. It aired between 1995 and 1996 on Shining Time Station and Mr. Conductor's Thomas Tales in the US. And when they got to terms of how to make the narrow gauge engines work for their TV series, Series 4 was well underway. We start off with the first episode of the series, Granpuff, based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, Duke the Lost Engine. This episode was the first return to form for the TV series, as it had another story based on the Railway series, and it was also the first introduction to some of the narrow gauge engines. One cold winter night on the island of Sodor, the howling winds keeps the engines in the shed awake. Toby decides that the engines need to listen to a mysterious story, albeit with a happy ending. Thomas then tells the others a story his driver told him recently, of 3 little engines who lived on a little railway in their own sheds. The story features a green engine named Stuart, a blue engine named Falcon, and an old brown tender engine named Duke, who was the oldest engine on the line and named after the Duke of Sodor. Duke felt very proud of this and decided that it was his responsibility to keep the younger engines just the way it was. While other engines came and went, Duke outlasted them all. Stuart and Falcon gave Duke the nickname Granpuff. The two were very fond of him, but they did sometimes tire of hearing about his grace and would occasionally tease him. One day, Duke soon warned Stuart and Falcon that if they did not behave, they would end up like Smudger, an engine he used to work with. Smudger was very cocky, conceited, and a careless show-off, who ran roughly and often derailed, spilling his loads. Duke tried to warn him, but Smudger simply did not care about some spills and laughed at Duke. However, he stopped laughing one day when the manager told him they were going to make him useful at last by taking his wheels away. From then on, the only running Smudger did was as a pumping generator behind the shed, and he was never able to move again. Stuart and Falcon began behaving better for several days after hearing about Smudger. They both became very useful and all three remained happy friends for years. However, this all came to an end one day when the engines had little to do because the hills and the mines were closed at a time, and so was their railway at last. As a result, the engines were all put up for sale. Stuart and Falcon were bought, but no one wanted to buy an old engine like Duke. Stuart promised Duke that he and Falcon would find another railway for him to run on. Duke's crew oiled and greased him one last time, put tarpaulins on him and bid a final goodbye as they locked him in the shed and left to find new jobs. Duke went to sleep, waiting for the day he would be able to run again. As time went by, torrents of rain washed soil down the mountains and plants grew around. Nobody would know that a small shed was there, nor an engine asleep inside it. Percy is disappointed that the story does not have a happy ending. Thomas assures Percy that there is one, but it will have to wait until another night. Despite being the second to last book for the Railway series, I think this is a really good way to start the fourth series on, starting off with a story about Duke the Lost Engine just to get things going. And it's a lovely introduction to the narrow gauge system of Sodor, as well as 3 of their engines. Duke is the oldest and most experienced of all the narrow gauge engines on Sodor. He's based on the Festiniog Railway small engine class 040 ST locomotives. Unlike the real small Englands, Duke is built to 2 foot and 3 inch gauge rather than 1 foot 11.5 inch gauge. Duke is the oldest, wisest and most experienced of the engines on the Skarloey Railway. He was a mentor to Stuart and Falcon, who were later renamed Peter, Sam and Sir Handel. I consider Duke to be like an old grandfather to Stuart and Falcon. Someone who cares about the 2 engines dearly like they were his own grandchildren and will stand no nonsense when they do anything that he thinks wrong. He's also very proud of being named after the Duke of Sodor, and is always sure to remind everybody of it, telling everyone what wouldn't suit his grace. And he's become one of the most popular characters in the Railway series as well as the TV series, since his model was recently bought by a fan and was repainted to resemble Duke, since it was repainted in the 5th series to represent another character which we'll get to for the 5th series next year. Stuart is extremely enthusiastic, eager and bubbly. He can be occasionally cheeky, but is kind-hearted, well-meaning and well-mannered. He is based on the Talaklim Railway's Edward Thomas, a Kerr Stuart tattoo class 042 ST. And Stuart aka Peter Sam is another one of those characters that's very iconic to the TV series, and has had a lot of merchandise sold of him. But to this day I'm still confused why they never sold an Ertl model of Peter Sam when he was called Stuart with his old funnel, since they made 2 Ertl models for Sir Handel, one being known as Sir Handel and the other one with his Falcon nameplate. Speaking of which, Falcon is prone to moody tantrums and figured that he knows better than others, suggesting a superiority complex. He has been known for being impulsive, arrogant, pompous, rude, stubborn, naughty and bad-tempered. Falcon is based off of the Talaklim Railway's Sir Hydrin, a Hughes Falcon 024 ST locomotive. And as the series would go on, we would get to learn more about Falcon's personality, especially after the name change. The episode also introduces us to our first non-Railway series engine, Smudger, a very vain, showing off his ways which caused accidents due to his carelessness. He also did not take advice from others or usually worry about problems, which he often brushed off. He was quite cheeky too, often taking lectures as jokes. Smudger was based on the Talaklim Railway's Dolgoch, and I probably butchered that name, a Fletcher Jennings class BB040WT, which would also be used for the livery of Rheneas, who was reintroduced later on in the series. And as I said, Smudger was the first engine for the TV series not created by Wilbert Awdry. His role, however, was based on that of Stanley from the Railway series book Duke the Lost Engine, and they both share American accents, but they obviously have different liveries and different engine types. And Michelangelos did give us that hilarious laugh of his. It cracks me up every time I hear it. This episode also goes down in history as being one of the saddest episodes of the TV series. I'd say it's on the same level of sadness as the sad story of Henry, since we don't get a happy ending for this story. Even Percy was quick to point it out at the end of the episode.
That's not a happy ending.
Ah, murmured Thomas sleepily. There will be, but that'll have to wait until next time.
Cheeky little devil. Michael Donnell and Junior Campbell once again nail it with the music. especially with the Skarloey Railway theme. And I admire how they use some of the music from Henry's Forest to represent Duke being left alone in the shed and being buried by soil and trees. It just makes the scene that much more effective, using such an iconic piece of music from the previous series. And even though this is the first time we see the narrow gauge engines and one of their railways, the setting just looks really gorgeous. You can really tell how much the models team has excelled with their props and what they could do with their model making. Just seeing all those mountains in the background as well as that quarry is just so gorgeous. It's really eye-catching for those who love beautiful sceneries, and it could put you in mind of the Welsh valleys, since Wales is known for their mountains. And I would know since I visited Wales a lot on occasions when I was a kid. And last year I did get to visit the Talaclyn Railway as well as some of the other narrow gauge lines. It just did a wonderful job at capturing that feel of the Talaclyn Railway and other Welsh narrow gauge railways. They just did an amazing job with their model making this year. And here's an interesting side note. I was first introduced to this episode through the VHS tape Thomas's Train and 17 Other Stories. And that tape didn't feature the next episode Sleeping Beauty on it. So I was watching the VHS tape not knowing what would happen to Duke at the end of that story. And it wasn't until I got the VHS tape Rock and Roll and Other Stories where I finally found out what happened to Duke after Granpuff. Series 4 was the first series that I was introduced to the TV series and didn't get to see all the episodes in the correct order. Most of the episodes from that series I mostly saw from compilation tapes. And it was very rare that I got to see the episodes in proper order at the time. And it wasn't until I got the 4th series DVD where I got to see them in their actual order. With all that said, Granpuff is one of the greatest episodes of the TV series in my opinion. It's a wonderful start to the 4th series, and it's a lovely introduction to the narrow gauge system of Sodor. It's an episode that I always look forward to re-watching every time I put the Series 4 DVD on. And it's an episode I do recommend checking out if you haven't seen it for quite some time. This episode might have a sad ending, but that just makes the happy ending in the next episode all that more special.